The dangerous truth about her husband's past, criminal story. Jenna had always considered herself a simple woman with simple needs. She didn't crave luxury or excitement. What she wanted, more than anything, was stability. Her life with Victor had been everything she'd ever dreamed of: secure, predictable, and comforting. The world was full of chaos, but in her home, with Victor by her side, Jenna felt as though she could retreat from the noise and just breathe. Every morning, she woke to the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the soft hum of their quiet suburban neighborhood. Their house was small but cozy, nestled in a cul-de-sac lined with towering oaks. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone and secrets were easy to keep. Or so she thought. Before we can continue, if you love crime stories, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now let's continue. Victor, her husband of 6 years, was a man who seemed to have it all figured out. He was well-spoken, intelligent, and outwardly kind, a successful finance executive who worked long hours at a prestigious firm. He was the kind of man who made people believe in hard work, loyalty, and the American dream. Jenna was proud of him, though she knew that his career demanded a lot of time and energy. He often came home late from work, his mind still running through spreadsheets and meetings. Yet, despite his demanding job, he always made time for her. The way he would look at her when he walked through the door, eyes warm, a soft smile tugging at his lips, made Jenna feel like the most important person in the world. She never questioned him. There was a comfort in his presence, an unspoken understanding that they had built something together that couldn't be broken. Their routines were predictable and comforting. They had their morning rituals. Victor would leave for work early, and Jenna would prepare breakfast. Later, they'd meet up for dinner, often discussing the mundane details of their day. And then, on weekends, they enjoyed long walks through the park, or, more often than not, they spent quiet evenings at home, curled up on the couch watching old movies. Their life was a peaceful one, full of small, meaningful moments that kept them grounded. In a world filled with uncertainty, their connection felt like a constant, something to hold on to. Victor was more than just a good husband. He was a man who took care of everything. If there was a problem with the house, a broken appliance, or even a flat tire, he was the one who fixed it. Jenna loved that about him. She was more than capable of handling things on her own, but there was something deeply reassuring in knowing that Victor could take care of her, that he would always step in to shoulder any burden that came their way. There was a stability in his actions, a predictability in the way he would always know the right thing to say or do. She never doubted him. In fact, she rarely had to ask for help, because he always anticipated her needs before she even voiced them. Their friends often commented on how well they complemented each other. Where Jenna was calm and introspective, Victor was outgoing and sociable. Together, they formed a partnership that seemed effortless, a team that had mastered the art of living harmoniously. At social gatherings, they were the couple everyone looked up to, always together, always in sync. Jenna couldn't imagine a life without Victor. He was her partner, her confidant, the person she trusted more than anyone else. In many ways, he represented everything she had ever wanted: a solid foundation, a shared future, and the comfort of knowing that no matter what happened in the world outside, they would always have each other. In the quiet moments of their life together, Jenna often found herself marveling at how lucky she was. It wasn't just that Victor was a good man. He was a man who made her feel safe, who understood her in ways no one else did. She had always been a bit reserved, a woman who found comfort in the small things rather than in grand gestures. And Victor understood that. He didn't overwhelm her with extravagance. He didn't need to. Instead, he gave her something far more valuable: consistency. Each day, he showed up for her in 1,000 little ways, whether it was leaving her sweet notes in the kitchen, sending texts just to check in, or planning spontaneous weekend getaways that were always just what she needed. He was her rock. Jenna had no idea how much she relied on the steadiness of her life with Victor until the day that it all began to unravel. She hadn't realized that, over time, she had allowed herself to depend on the routine they'd built together. Everything in their life had been so smooth, so effortless, that it never occurred to her to question whether their foundation was truly as solid as it seemed. But then, one fateful afternoon, Jenna found herself standing in front of their closet, pulling down old boxes to make space for some new things. It was a task she had done 100 times before, but on this particular day, something was different. Maybe it was the faint smell of dust in the air, or the way the afternoon sunlight filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the room. But when her hand brushed against a cardboard box tucked away at the back of the closet, something inside her stirred. The box was old, its edges frayed and worn, as if it had been there for years. It didn't belong, not in a place where they kept things they actually used. It was out of place in their otherwise organized and carefully curated home. Her curiosity got the best of her, and she pulled the box down. At first, it felt light in her hands, but when she opened it, a strange weight settled in her chest. Inside the box were stacks of papers, clippings from newspapers, photographs, and what appeared to be official documents, all yellowed with age. Jenna didn't know what she was looking at, but there was a sense of unease that grew inside her as she sifted through the papers. Her eyes landed on a headline: "Local businessman faces charges in brutal attack." The words hit her like a punch in the gut, and she felt the ground beneath her feet shift. The article described a violent assault, one that had left a man near death. The name in the story wasn't Victor's, but there was something about it that made her stomach turn. A series of photographs followed, showing a man she didn't recognize, but whose eyes seemed eerily familiar. She flipped through the papers, her pulse quickening. And then, as if the universe had conspired against her, she found a name: Victor's. The world seemed to slow down as Jenna read the report, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. The details were disturbing. The story described a violent incident, one that left a family shattered, with accusations that Victor had been involved in a gruesome attack years before they had met. How was this possible? How could Victor, the man she had married, the man who had built a life with her, be connected to such a crime? Her head swam with disbelief. Her breath grew shallow as her thoughts tumbled over one another, and suddenly, everything about their life, their home, their love, their shared history, seemed like a lie. Jenna's first instinct was to deny what she was reading. It couldn't be true. It had to be some kind of mistake. But the more she read, the clearer it became that the documents weren't just random clippings. They were official records, police reports, and court documents. She couldn't ignore them. This wasn't just a moment of confusion or misunderstanding. She was holding the key to a dark truth about the man she had loved for so long. And as the weight of that truth settled on her, Jenna felt her world crack wide open. Nothing would ever be the same again. Jenna could feel her heart racing as she stared at the documents in her hands. The headline of the newspaper article seemed to pulse in her vision, its words growing more distorted with every passing second. "Local businessman faces charges in brutal attack." She had read it over and over again, but each time, the meaning behind those words sank deeper into her chest, squeezing the air out of her lungs. She couldn't process it. Her mind was too overwhelmed with shock, too full of questions. Was this a mistake? How could this be happening? She had to be wrong. It had to be some kind of terrible misunderstanding. But the longer she held the articles, the more the unease crept through her veins. She flipped through the pages slowly, as if in disbelief that the words could be true. The police report was clear. Victor's name appeared in connection with a crime she could never have imagined. The report told the story of a violent assault, the kind that left scars on the victims' bodies and souls. One man had been severely injured, nearly to the point of death, and the accusations painted Victor as an accomplice to the attack, with the potential for murder. The more Jenna read, the more she realized the crime wasn't just something distant or minor. It was deeply disturbing, and Victor had been named as a key figure in the event. She could hardly breathe. The world around her seemed to have lost its shape. Her once serene living room now felt like a foreign place, its familiar surroundings mocking her, as if everything she thought she knew was suddenly fake. This wasn't just a paper she had found in an old box. It was a window into a version of Victor she could never have imagined. How could this be true? The man she had married, the man she had trusted so deeply, could not have been involved in something like this. He was kind, loving, and attentive. He had always been that way. He was Victor, her husband, the man who could never hurt anyone. Yet, the evidence in front of her was undeniable. The police report described the brutality of the crime, its cold details about the victim's injuries, and the subsequent investigation. It painted a picture of a man, Victor, who had allegedly played a role in the violence. Jenna felt a wave of nausea rise within her vision swimming. She couldn't focus on the words anymore. The thought of this other side of Victor, a side she had never seen, was too much to bear. Could he have been hiding this from her all along? Could he have lived a double life for their entire marriage? It was then that Jenna realized the magnitude of the situation. This wasn't just a case of her husband making a mistake or getting involved in something bad. It was the revelation of something much darker. If these papers were true, then Victor wasn't just a man with a past he was trying to forget. He was a man who had been involved in serious criminal activity, someone capable of violence. Someone who had never told her the truth about who he was and who he had been before they met. Jenna felt a strange mix of fear and anger welling up inside her. How could he keep this from her for so long? What kind of life had she been living, if all the while, the man she trusted above anyone else had been hiding something so monstrous? In that moment, Jenna felt like a fool. She had been living in a comfortable bubble of denial, believing that everything was perfect when, in reality, she had been blind to the man sitting across the dinner table from her each night. She had never thought to ask about Victor's past, never thought it might be important to know what kind of person he had been before they had built their life together. She had trusted him implicitly, never questioning the one thing that might have been the most important, what he had left behind. And now it was too late. The truth was right there, staring her in the face. She could no longer ignore it, no longer pretend that everything was fine. Jenna's thoughts spiraled as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. She had always known that Victor was a private man, someone who didn't like to talk about his past. But this was something else entirely. She had always assumed his reluctance to talk about his previous relationships, or where he had grown up, was simply because he was a man who preferred to keep the past in the past. She had understood that, had even respected it. But now, looking at the documents in front of her, she saw how foolish she had been. In keeping his past hidden, Victor had kept her in the dark about a life that was far from ordinary. The truth was, he wasn't just a quiet man who wanted to move on from his past. He had a past that was dangerous, a past that involved violence and crime. The next thought that cut through Jenna's mind was even more terrifying. If Victor could hide something like this from her for all these years, what else was he hiding? What else could he be capable of? The man who had held her hand through difficult times, who had been there for her when she was at her lowest, who had promised her he would protect her. Had he been living a lie all along? Could she trust anything about him anymore? Jenna's mind raced. She had always trusted Victor above everyone else in her life. He had been the one person who made her feel safe, who made her feel that no matter what happened in the world, she would be okay as long as he was there. Now, everything felt like a lie. Who was he? And more importantly, who was she if she had been married to someone like this? Her instincts screamed at her to confront Victor, to demand answers. But what kind of answers could he possibly give her? The report was clear. There was no escaping the facts. He had been involved in something horrific. He couldn't deny it, not when the documents were staring him in the face. But Jenna knew that confronting him would be complicated. If he had lied about something as serious as this, what other lies had he told? How much of their life together had been built on deceit? That night, as Victor came home from work, Jenna sat on the couch, the documents still in her hands, the weight of the world pressing down on her chest. She hadn't told him anything yet, and she didn't know how to. How could she even begin to explain what she had discovered? How could she ask the man she had loved, the man she had shared her life with, the man who had been her protector for so many years, to explain the unexplainable? How could she face the truth of what he had done, and then decide what to do with it? When he walked into the room, she saw the familiar, comforting smile spread across his face. It was the smile that had always made her feel safe, the smile that had made her believe in their future. But now, in that moment, it felt hollow. He could never have known what she was about to ask him, what she was about to uncover. "Jenna?" Victor's voice cut through her thoughts. "You okay?" She didn't respond right away, the storm inside her mind too strong to put into words. She could feel her heart pounding, the documents heavy in her hands. Finally, she looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Victor, we need to talk." For a moment, his expression flickered with confusion, but then he quickly masked it with his usual calm. "Sure, what's on your mind?" Jenna took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had to confront him. There was no other way. Holding up the papers, she said, her voice shaking. "I found something. I found these in the closet." She handed him the documents, watching his face closely for any sign of recognition. But he took them without a word, his eyes flicking to the first page, then to the second, and then his face went pale. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the faint sound of Victor's breathing. His jaw tightened, his grip on the papers growing white-knuckled. He didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at the page in disbelief. It wasn't until Jenna took a step forward, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger, that he finally spoke. "Jenna, he started, but his voice faltered. He looked at her with wide, haunted eyes, as though he had never expected her to discover the truth. Jenna took another step, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. "What is this, Victor?" Her voice cracked, but she pushed through it. "What is this, and why didn't you tell me?" Victor swallowed hard, his face flushed with something Jenna couldn't name. Guilt, perhaps? Fear? But there was also something else in his eyes. Something dark, a shadow of a man she no longer recognized. And for the first time in their marriage, Jenna saw a side of Victor she had never imagined. Vulnerability mixed with something much darker. The man who had once seemed untouchable, perfect even, now seemed entirely human and entirely capable of something monstrous. Jenna stood there, frozen, her eyes locked on Victor as he clutched the documents in his trembling hands. The air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating. Every breath she took was a struggle, the reality of what she had uncovered beginning to feel too much to bear. She had confronted him, but she hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the paralysis, the quiet tension that filled the space between them. It was as if time had stopped, and neither of them knew what to say next. Victor remained silent, staring at the papers, his face pale, his features tight with strain. She could see his pulse beating at his throat, and for the first time, he seemed genuinely afraid. Jenna's mind raced. How could he be afraid? He was the one who had been hiding this, the one who had been living a lie for all these years. But it wasn't just fear that she saw in him. It was something darker, something that hinted at years of secrets buried beneath the surface. "Victor," her voice faltered, and she had to clear her throat before she could continue. "How long have you been hiding this from me? Why didn't you tell me?" Victor lifted his head, his gaze meeting hers, but there was no trace of the comforting smile she had once known so well. Instead, his eyes were filled with something she couldn't quite identify. Regret, yes, but also something colder. "Jenna, he started, but his voice trailed off, as if the words were too heavy to come out. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, they were filled with a desperate kind of pleading. "I didn't want to burden you with this. I thought I could leave it all behind," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was a mistake, Jenna. A mistake I made before we even met." Jenna's hands shook, and she tightened her grip on the edge of the coffee table, trying to steady herself. A mistake? A mistake that had left a man near death? A mistake that could have ruined innocent lives? Jenna could feel the anger rising inside her, hot and uncontrollable. She wanted to scream at him, to demand more answers, to force him to tell her the truth. But she couldn't speak. The weight of his betrayal was suffocating. Victor took a hesitant step toward her, his voice soft, almost pleading. "Please let me explain. I never meant for any of this to happen. It was a long time ago. I'm not that man anymore, I swear." Jenna's heart raced. Not that man anymore? He had never been that man to her, and that was the problem. She had trusted him with everything. He was the one who had convinced her that their life was built on honesty, on mutual respect. He was the one who had painted a picture of stability and security. But now, all of that felt like a lie. "Then what is all of this, Victor?" she asked, her voice low but full of raw emotion. "What am I supposed to do with this? You can't just tell me it was a mistake and expect me to forget it." "I can't forget it." Victor's shoulders slumped, as if the weight of her words was too much to bear. He looked like a man on the edge, someone who knew he had reached a point of no return. His face was drawn, the lines of stress and guilt deepening with every passing second. "I didn't want you to find out this way," he said softly, his voice shaking. "I thought if I kept it hidden long enough, I could protect you from it. Protect you from my past." Jenna felt a sharp pang of betrayal. Protect her? He had been protecting himself, not her. If he truly cared about her, if he truly wanted to protect her, he never would have kept something like this from her. Never would have hidden the truth, the kind of truth that could destroy everything they had built together. "Why?" Jenna managed to ask, her voice trembling with frustration. "Why keep it from me? Why not tell me when we got serious? When we got married?" She felt her throat tighten as the words tumbled out. "I would have understood, Victor. I would have understood, but you kept this from me. You lied to me every single day." Victor winced as though her words had physically struck him. He took another step toward her, his face twisted with regret. "I know, Jenna. I know I made a terrible mistake, but I was scared. I thought that if you knew the truth about who I was, who I used to be, you'd leave me. And I couldn't live with that. I didn't want to lose you." Jenna could feel the tears stinging the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. He was scared. He had made her live a lie for years, and now he was telling her that it was all out of fear? She could hardly believe it. "So, you thought it was better to just hide it? To keep me in the dark?" "I didn't know what else to do," he said, his voice cracking. "I thought I could move on, leave that part of my life behind. But the past, it doesn't let you go that easily. It never does." Jenna stared at him for a long moment, her mind whirling with questions, but more than anything, she felt a deep, insistent need to know the truth. She had to understand what had happened, what kind of man Victor had been. And more importantly, she had to know why he was still hiding something from her, something that could change everything. "Tell me what happened, Victor," she said, her voice cold now, the shock giving way to a more controlled, dangerous calm. "Tell me everything." Victor hesitated, his eyes flicking to the documents she had found. His face twisted in pain, as though speaking the truth would rip him apart. He sank down onto the couch, his hands shaking as he stared at the papers. "It was years ago," he started slowly, his voice distant, as though he were pulling himself back to a time he wished to forget. "I was involved with some bad people. People who used their power and money to get whatever they wanted. I made a lot of mistakes, Jenna. I was trying to prove something, trying to climb the ladder. And in the process, I got in too deep." Jenna sat down beside him, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel the tension in his body, the pain that radiated off of him. But she didn't let herself feel sorry for him. Not yet. She needed to hear everything, no matter how much it hurt. "Who were these people?" Jenna asked, her voice tight. "What did they make you do?" Victor's hands clenched into fists. "I wasn't proud of it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I could get out, that I could leave it behind. But I couldn't. I was weak. I let myself get involved in things I shouldn't have. The assault, it was a job, a favor for a business associate. I didn't know how far it would go. But once it started, I couldn't stop it. I couldn't get out." Jenna felt a cold wave of disgust wash over her. "You let a man get hurt. You helped hurt him." Victor's head dropped into his hands, his body shaking. "I never meant for it to happen. I swear. But by the time I realized how bad it was, I was already in too deep. And when the police started asking questions, I panicked. I thought they'd come for me, that I'd lose everything. So I ran. I left. I changed my name. I tried to disappear." Jenna couldn't process all of this, couldn't comprehend how the man she loved could have been involved in something so vile. "So, you just left everything behind?" You just ran. Victor nodded slowly, his face pale. Yes. I thought I could start over. And for a while, I did. But the past, it has a way of catching up with you. Jenna's mind was reeling. She felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss that she had never even known existed. The man she had loved for years, the man who had shared her life, had been a completely different person. A man who had done unspeakable things and then tried to bury it all under a veneer of normalcy. I never wanted this life for you, Jenna, he said quietly. I thought I could protect you from all of it. But now I see I've destroyed everything. Jenna sat in stunned silence, her heart hammering in her chest. She had asked for the truth, but now that it was laid out in front of her, she wasn't sure she could handle it. Could she forgive him? Could she move past this? She didn't know. But what she did know was that the world she had known had crumbled away in an instant, and there was no going back. Jenna's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, each thought crashing into the next, faster and harder than she could handle. She had always prided herself on being strong, on being able to face whatever life threw her way, but this was different. She had spent years building a life with Victor, one that she thought was safe, stable, and filled with love. Now, in an instant, everything she thought she knew had shattered. Victor's confession hung in the air between them, a thick, suffocating presence that neither of them could escape. Jenna stood in the living room, her arms wrapped tightly around her body as if trying to hold herself together. She had asked for the truth, and Victor had given it to her, painful, ugly, and raw. But the truth wasn't enough. The truth didn't fix the years of lies, the secrets, the betrayal. It didn't erase the image of Victor as a man capable of hurting others, of being involved in something so vile, so dangerous. Victor, on the other hand, was a man broken. His confession had left him raw and exposed, stripped of the calm, collected facade he had worked so hard to maintain. His face was pale, and the remorse that radiated from him was almost suffocating. He had told her everything, confessed his past mistakes in a way that seemed as if he were pleading for forgiveness, but Jenna wasn't sure he deserved it. Not yet, anyway. I never wanted this for us, he repeated, his voice weak and apologetic. You need to understand that. I didn't want to hurt you. Jenna shook her head, unable to speak at first. She didn't know what to say. What could she say? The words she had been preparing in her mind, the questions, the accusations, felt hollow now. Nothing felt real. Not the man standing in front of her, nor the life they had built together. She didn't know who Victor was anymore. She didn't know if she could trust him. Victor took a hesitant step toward her, his eyes searching her face. Jenna, please. I know you're angry. I know this is hard to hear. But I'm begging you, don't let my past destroy everything we've built. I love you. The words stung. You love me. Jenna repeated, her voice icy. Is that what this is? You love me, but you thought it was okay to hide your past from me? You thought it was okay to pretend to be someone you're not? You thought you could just erase what you did and move on? Victor's face tightened with pain. He seemed to take a step back, as though her words had physically pushed him away. I didn't know how to tell you, Jenna. I was terrified of losing you. I thought if I just buried it all, I could protect you from it. From me. Jenna laughed bitterly, a harsh sound that filled the room. Protect me? By lying to me? By hiding a part of yourself that was so monstrous? You didn't protect me, Victor. You used me. You used our marriage, our life together, as a cover for your past. Victor's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Jenna felt a flicker of sympathy. But it was fleeting. How could she feel sorry for him? How could she forgive him when everything she had believed in had been a lie? I never wanted to be that man again, Jenna, he whispered, his voice hoarse. I've been trying to move forward. I thought I could be someone different. I thought that maybe, if I built a life with you, I could forget what I did. Forget. Jenna's voice cracked, and for a moment, she had to fight to regain control of herself. She felt like she was drowning in her own anger and disbelief. You can't just forget something like this, Victor. You can't just erase it like it never happened. People were hurt. Lives were ruined. You can't sweep it all under the rug and pretend it never happened. Victor fell silent, his face crumpling as if the weight of her words was too much for him to bear. He slumped onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. Jenna stood there, watching him, her chest tight with emotion. She had asked for the truth, but now that she had it, it felt like a burden too heavy to carry. For hours, they sat in silence, neither of them knowing what to do next. The reality of their situation was too overwhelming to process in one sitting. Jenna knew that she needed to make a decision, but how could she? Could she ever move past this? Could she ever forgive Victor? The next day, Jenna packed her bags. The decision hadn't come easily. She had spent the entire night in turmoil, unable to sleep, her mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. On the one hand, she couldn't deny the love she had once felt for Victor. She had loved him deeply, and she had built a life with him, a life that, in the beginning, had felt like a dream. But now, that dream was in ruins. How could she stay with a man who had concealed a part of himself so dark? A part that was capable of violence and manipulation? The memory of the police report, the vivid images of the crime, kept coming back to her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had been living with a stranger. And no matter how much Victor claimed to have changed, no matter how much he apologized, Jenna couldn't ignore the fact that the man standing before her was a man with blood on his hands. As she walked through the house, collecting her things, her heart ached. This had been her home, her sanctuary, and now it felt like a prison. Every corner seemed to remind her of something false, something she had believed in that had turned out to be a lie. She had once felt safe here, secure in her marriage. But now, that security felt like a lie, a veneer covering something much darker. When she finished packing, Jenna found herself standing in the doorway of their bedroom, looking at the bed they had shared, the life they had built. She felt numb. She couldn't bring herself to look at Victor. She had already said everything she needed to say. As she stepped into the hallway, she heard Victor's voice. "Jenna, please don't leave. Please." His words stopped her in her tracks, and she closed her eyes, fighting back tears. She didn't want to leave. She didn't want to walk away from the life she had known for so many years. But she had no choice. She had to get out. "I'm sorry, Victor," she whispered, her voice shaking. "But I can't stay. Not after everything. I need time. I need space." She didn't wait for a response. She didn't want to hear him beg her to stay, didn't want to hear the desperation in his voice. As she left the house, she could feel her heart breaking with every step. She wasn't just leaving Victor. She was leaving behind the future she had imagined, the safety she had always felt in his arms. But the truth, as painful as it was, had changed everything. And there was no going back. For the next few days, Jenna found herself living in a strange limbo. She stayed in a small, cramped apartment downtown, far from the house she had shared with Victor. The change of environment did little to soothe her mind, though. She couldn't stop thinking about him, couldn't stop replaying every moment, every conversation, every lie. Her body ached with exhaustion, but sleep eluded her. Every time she closed her eyes, the images of Victor's confession flashed in her mind. The guilt in his eyes, the remorse in his voice, the things he had done before they had even met, things he had never shared with her. It wasn't just that he had kept secrets, it was that those secrets were so dark, so far removed from the man she had thought he was. Days turned into a blur, and Jenna found herself slipping into a pattern of avoidance. She didn't answer his calls. She didn't respond to his messages. She couldn't bear to hear his voice again, not yet. Not until she had figured out what to do with this knowledge. But even in the silence, she knew one thing for certain. She had to confront the truth. She had to decide whether she could ever go back to him. But more than that, she had to decide who she was in all of this, whether she was the woman who could forgive a man capable of such violence, or the woman who had to move on, no matter how much it hurt. Jenna's life after leaving Victor felt like a temporary respite from a nightmare she wasn't sure she'd ever wake from. It had been a few weeks since she had moved into the small downtown apartment. The walls felt thin, the space cold, but it was hers. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she was alone. At first, the silence was deafening, almost unbearable. The constant hum of thoughts, questions, fears, doubts, had no outlet. She found herself pacing the apartment at all hours, trying to make sense of the events that had unfolded, but nothing seemed clear. Her mind felt clouded by grief, anger, and confusion. She had moved out to escape the crushing weight of the truth Victor had revealed. Yet even with all the distance between them, she couldn't seem to escape him. The image of his tear-streaked face, the pleading in his eyes, haunted her every moment. He had begged for forgiveness, promised he would change, swore up and down that his past mistakes were just that, mistakes, something he had grown past. But Jenna wasn't so sure. Could she ever trust him again? Could she ever believe that the man she had loved for years wasn't capable of something so horrifying? Each night, she thought about going back. She thought about reaching out to him, hearing his side of the story more fully, understanding the depth of his regret. But in her heart, something kept her from doing it. A deep, gnawing fear. What if he wasn't the man he claimed to be? What if, buried beneath the remorse and the pleading, there was still a part of him that was dangerous? Jenna didn't want to go back to that house. She didn't want to return to the man who had lied to her, who had concealed the darkest corners of his past. She had asked for the truth, and he had given it to her. But it wasn't the truth that had set her free. It was the space, the distance, that allowed her to breathe again. The more she stayed in the apartment, the more she realized that this was her only chance to rebuild her life. To rediscover who she was without the weight of his secrets on her shoulders. As the days turned into weeks, Jenna found herself piecing together the life she had before Victor. She started small, going out with friends she hadn't seen in years, re-engaging in hobbies she had put on hold. But no matter how many distractions she threw at herself, she couldn't escape the guilt gnawing at her. The truth of what had happened still hung in the air like a dark cloud, and it followed her everywhere. But it wasn't just the memories of Victor's past that plagued her. Jenna felt a constant pressure to move on, to do something with the pain. The idea of confronting Victor again, it lingered in her mind. She wanted answers. She wanted closure. But did she really want the truth? Or did she just want to see him suffer, to make him feel the weight of the pain he had caused her? She had always believed in justice. It was something she had been raised with, something that had always guided her moral compass. But now that she had faced the raw reality of Victor's past, the lines between right and wrong seemed blurrier than ever. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that what Victor had done wasn't just a crime against the law. It had been a crime against their relationship, against the very fabric of their trust. The decision to leave him had been born out of desperation. But the longer she was away, the more she realized that her choice to stay away was also an attempt at self-preservation. She couldn't go back. Not just because of what Victor had done, but because of what it had done to her. One morning, as Jenna sat at the small kitchen table, sipping her coffee, she found herself reaching for the phone. Her hand hovered over the screen, her fingers trembling slightly. For weeks, she had refused to contact Victor. But now, something was shifting inside her. She had spent so much time locked in her head, replaying every conversation, every moment of their relationship, but she needed to hear from him again. She needed to understand, once and for all, if there was any hope for them. With a deep breath, Jenna pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, and then Victor's voice came through, hesitant but familiar. "Jenna? Is that you?" His voice cracked slightly, and for a moment, Jenna was almost overcome with emotion. But she steeled herself. This was not a conversation for emotions. It was a conversation for answers. I need to talk to you," she said, her voice steady, but with an undercurrent of pain. "Can we meet?" There was a long pause, and Jenna could almost hear the hesitation in his voice. But then, he answered, his words rushed, almost desperate. "Yes, of course. Anywhere. Just tell me when and where." They agreed to meet at a small cafe on the edge of town, one that neither of them had frequented during their time together. It felt neutral, almost impersonal. Jenna wasn't sure what she was expecting from this meeting, maybe an apology, maybe more lies, but she knew that if she was ever going to move forward, She had to face him again. She needed to understand if there was anything left to salvage. When Jenna arrived at the cafe, Victor was already sitting at a table in the corner. He looked smaller than she remembered, his posture hunched, his face drawn and weary. The man who had once been so confident, so sure of himself, now looked like a shadow of his former self. Jenna took a deep breath before walking over to him. "Victor," she said, her voice steady but cold. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Jenna, I didn't know if you'd ever talk to me again. I've been thinking about you every day, every minute. I never wanted to hurt you." Jenna sat down, not sure what to say at first. She had heard it all before. His words, his pleas for forgiveness, they no longer held the same weight. She had learned that love and remorse were not enough to undo the damage done by years of lies. "You've already said that," Jenna replied. "But the truth is, I need to hear more. I need to understand why. Why did you do it? Why didn't you tell me? Why did you hide it from me?" Victor's face crumpled, and he looked away, his eyes clouded with guilt. "I didn't know how to tell you, Jenna. I didn't know how to make you see me for who I am now, not for who I was. I thought if I kept it buried, if I kept the past in the past, we could have a future together." Jenna felt a pang of pity for him, but she quickly pushed it aside. "But that's the problem, Victor. You didn't give me a chance to choose. You kept me in the dark, and now everything's different. You didn't just hurt me, you hurt us. You destroyed everything we had." Victor looked down at his hands, and Jenna could see that he was trembling. The pain on his face was palpable. "I know," he whispered. "I know. And I'm sorry, Jenna. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right if you'll let me." Jenna looked at him for a long moment, the weight of his words settling over her. This was the moment of truth, the moment she had been waiting for. Did she still love him? Could she forgive him? Could she ever trust him again? But the longer she looked at him, the more she realized that this wasn't about forgiveness.
It wasn't even about him.
It was about her, about the life she wanted for herself. And she realized, with a clarity she had never had before, that she didn't need him to complete her life. She didn't need his redemption. She needed to save herself. "I've made my decision, Victor," Jenna said softly, her voice calm but firm. "I can't go back. I can't live in the shadow of your past anymore. I need to move forward, and I need to do that without you." Victor's face crumpled, and for a brief moment, Jenna saw the man he once was, the man she had loved, the man she had hoped to spend her life with. But that was before. That was the man who had lied, the man who had hidden his true self from her. And that man, for all the pain he had caused her, didn't exist anymore. "I'm sorry," Jenna repeated, her voice thick with emotion. "But I have to let you go." She stood up and turned away, walking out of the cafe, without looking back. Jenna didn't know how to feel after the meeting with Victor. For days, her mind buzzed with confusion, self-doubt, and a deep, gnawing emptiness. She had hoped that walking away from him would bring clarity, but instead, it had left her feeling more lost than ever. The decision to leave had been painful, and although she felt justified in her choice, the reality of living without him felt like a constant ache in her chest. At first, the relief had been almost palpable. The silence of her apartment had been comforting, and the absence of Victor's presence felt like freedom. No more lies. No more secrets. No more fear of waking up to the truth buried beneath layers of charm and manipulation. But as the days passed, Jenna began to feel something darker, something she hadn't expected, a creeping sense of loss. The apartment that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a tomb. The space she had taken for herself began to feel too empty, the stillness too oppressive. She had spent so many years building a life with Victor that now, in the wake of their separation, everything seemed hollow. Each morning, she would wake up to the reality of her decision, and each night she would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had done the right thing. But the pain was not just about missing him. It was the realization that her whole life had been a lie. The man she had loved, trusted, and built a future with was not the man she thought he was. The betrayal was profound, And no amount of distance could erase the fact that the person she had married had been hiding a brutal, unforgivable part of himself. That dark truth now seemed to follow her everywhere she went. It weighed on her like a physical burden, suffocating her with its constant presence. Jenna found herself questioning everything about her past. What did she really know about Victor? How much of what they had shared had been genuine? For years, she had been blind to his past, to the things he had done before they met. She had trusted him implicitly, believing that the man who held her at night was the same man he was when they first met, kind, compassionate, devoted. But now she realized how much of his true self had been hidden from her. Every tender word, every romantic gesture, every whispered promise had been tainted by the knowledge that they had been built on a foundation of lies. As the weeks passed, Jenna's world began to crumble around her. The once familiar, stable life she had built with Victor felt like it had been wiped away in an instant. The friends she had once considered close seemed distant now, as though they, too, had been affected by her separation. Some were supportive, of course, but others were uncomfortable, unsure of how to respond to her new reality. Her social circles began to shrink, and with it, her sense of belonging. Her career, which had always been a source of pride, also seemed less certain. Her mind was always clouded by the events surrounding Victor. She couldn't focus on her work the way she used to. The worst part, though, was the guilt. Jenna had told herself that walking away from Victor was the right thing to do, that she deserved more than a life built on deceit. She had tried to convince herself that she was doing the right thing by choosing herself. But every time she thought about him, about the broken man she had left behind, her heart would break all over again. He had been desperate. He had begged her to come back. He had promised that he would change, that he would be the man she needed. But Jenna couldn't erase the memory of what he had done. He had killed someone. He had been part of a brutal crime, something that was beyond the realm of a simple mistake. And she couldn't forget the fear she had felt when he admitted it. She couldn't forget the anger and the betrayal. Despite all the reassurances Victor had given her, Jenna couldn't ignore the fact that she would always be looking over her shoulder. Would he hurt her? Would he come back into her life, trying to win her over with promises of redemption, only to reveal a darker side of himself again? The truth was, she would never be able to trust him fully. And without trust, there could be no reconciliation. The more Jenna thought about it, the more she realized that her decision to leave was about more than just Victor's past. It was about her own survival. It was about protecting herself from the consequences of his actions, from the dangers that lay in the darkness of his soul. She had seen glimpses of it in their life together, his short temper, his volatile moods, his manipulative tendencies. But she had always brushed it off, believing that he was just under pressure, just stressed out, or maybe even hiding from his past. Now, she knew better. The turning point came late one evening when Jenna received a call from the police. "Is this Jenna Brown?" the officer asked. His voice was formal but tinged with something Jenna couldn't quite place. Concern, maybe? "Yes," she replied, her heart starting to race. "I'm Officer Daniels from the city's police department. We need to talk to you about an incident involving your ex-husband, Victor Brown. Are you available to speak?" Jenna's blood ran cold. Her body froze in place as the words registered in her mind. She barely heard the rest of the officer's explanation. Victor? What had happened? Was he hurt? Had something happened to him? "Please come to the station," the officer added. "There are some details we need to discuss." It took all of Jenna's strength to walk out of her apartment. Her mind raced, filled with scenarios, each one worse than the last. What had Victor done now? The guilt, the self-doubt, the overwhelming fear. All of it rushed back to her. She couldn't shake the feeling that somehow this was her fault. If she had never left, if she had never confronted him about the past, maybe none of this would have happened. When Jenna arrived at the police station, she was ushered into a small, dimly lit room. Officer Daniels was waiting for her, a somber expression on his face. "I'm afraid there's been an incident," he began. "Victor Brown was found in an alley near the downtown district early this morning. He was injured. He's in critical condition." Jenna's breath caught in her throat. "Injured? How badly?" "Is he dead?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling. "No, but it's touch and go," Officer Daniels replied. "We're still trying to piece together what happened. It looks like he was attacked, but we're not sure who is responsible." Jenna's mind spun as the officer continued speaking. She wanted to feel relief, to feel that this was some sort of karmic justice, but the truth was, she felt nothing but confusion. How had Victor ended up in such a situation? Who would do something like this to him? Was it someone from his past? Someone who knew the dark secrets he had tried so hard to bury? Or was it something else entirely? The officer's next words hit her like a slap in the face. "Jenna, there's more. We found evidence linking Victor to several unsolved cases. It seems his past isn't as far behind him as we thought." Jenna's legs went weak, and she had to sit down. Her head was spinning. How could this be happening? She thought she had escaped it all. She thought that by leaving, by cutting ties with Victor, she had left his darkness behind. But it wasn't over. It was never over. Over the next few days, the news broke. Victor's criminal history, the one she had once believed to be in the past, was being dragged out into the light. His involvement in the brutal crime years ago had been the tip of the iceberg. There were whispers of more victims, more incidents of violence he had been involved in, each one worse than the last. Jenna had no idea how deep his crimes had run. She was shaken to her core by the realization that the man she had married had been living a double life, one she had never truly seen. Jenna's world felt like it was unraveling. Everything she had believed, everything she had worked so hard to build with Victor, was now tainted by his past. And yet, even as she faced the horror of his crimes coming to light, she couldn't ignore the emptiness inside her. The realization hit her hard. She had wanted to escape Victor's past, to live a life free of the secrets and lies that had haunted their marriage. But in doing so, she had paid the ultimate price, the destruction of her own peace of mind, the shattering of her own identity. For weeks, Jenna had fought to move forward, to reclaim her life. But the truth, as painful as it was, had taken something from her. She had made the right decision by leaving Victor, but she had also lost a part of herself in the process. Her own sense of self was now clouded by the shadows of the past, and she wasn't sure she would ever fully escape it. It had been months since Jenna had last seen Victor, but the weight of the past still clung to her like a shroud, an invisible barrier that haunted every moment of her waking life. The decision to leave him had been right, even necessary, but it hadn't been easy. In fact, it had been the hardest thing she had ever done. The truth about Victor's past, the darkness that had lurked beneath the surface of their marriage, had shattered everything she thought she knew about him and about herself. Jenna had always considered herself a strong person, someone who was capable of handling the ups and downs of life. But what she hadn't anticipated was how deeply the truth would cut into her sense of identity. Leaving Victor had meant more than just walking away from him. It had meant walking away from the life they had built together, from the future she had imagined with him. It had meant letting go of a version of herself that had been shaped by that love, by that commitment. But as the months passed, Jenna began to realize something that both comforted and terrified her. She wasn't the same person anymore. The woman who had walked out of that house, heartbroken and terrified, was gone. In her place was someone different, someone who had learned painful truths about herself and about the man she had married, someone who was forced to confront the lies that had been woven into the fabric of her reality. And while it had been agonizing to face those truths, Jenna knew that they had changed her irrevocably. She had spent countless nights trying to rebuild her life. Slowly, she reestablished old friendships, reconnecting with people she had distanced herself from while consumed by her relationship with Victor. She threw herself into her work, focusing on her career in a way she hadn't been able to do when her life had been overshadowed by the constant tension between her love for Victor and the fear of his secrets. But no matter how much she tried to move forward, the specter of Victor's crimes still loomed over her. It was in the quiet moments, those times when her mind wandered, that the full gravity of what she had endured sank in. She had always thought she knew what love was, but now, in the wake of everything that had happened, Jenna wasn't so sure. Was love supposed to be so complicated, so filled with lies and deceit? Could love survive when the very foundation it was built on turned out to be rotten? Was it possible to truly move on from something that had been so deeply ingrained in her life for years? Despite the ongoing turmoil within her, Jenna had made a conscious decision to stop looking back. She was not going to be defined by the mistakes of her past. She refused to let Victor's actions determine her future. The thought of him, the memory of his confession, was no longer a source of weakness for her. She had taken back control, reclaiming the life that had been taken from her by his deceit. But then the call came. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when Jenna's phone buzzed, and the familiar name on the screen made her stomach lurch. It was Victor's name. She had not spoken to him since their last, painful encounter months ago. He had tried to reach her numerous times since then, but she had ignored every call, every text. She had made it clear that she wanted nothing more to do with him, that she needed space to heal, to process everything that had happened. And yet here he was again, reaching out, seeking some kind of contact. The temptation to pick up the phone was strong, but Jenna resisted. She knew that engaging with Victor would open up old wounds, drag her back into a world she had spent so much time trying to escape. But as the call went unanswered, it left her with an unsettling feeling, a sense of unfinished business that she couldn't ignore. It was only later that evening, as she sat on her balcony, watching the world go by, that she gave in. She couldn't explain why she did it, but something inside her urged her to listen to what he had to say. It was not forgiveness she was after, and it certainly wasn't reconciliation. No, what Jenna needed was closure. She needed to hear from Victor himself just how far gone he was, just how deep the damage truly ran. She needed to know that he had faced the consequences of his actions, that he understood what he had done to her. So, she called him back. When Victor answered, there was no anger in his voice, no pleading, no desperation. He sounded different, calm, almost resigned, as if he had finally accepted what had happened. "Jenna," he said softly, "I didn't know if you'd ever talk to me again, but I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you long ago." Jenna braced herself for what was coming. She had no illusions about what Victor was capable of. His past, the darkness that had been hidden for so long, was something that could never be fully erased. But she needed to hear it. She needed to understand how much of the man she had loved was still there, buried beneath the layers of guilt and shame. "I've been to therapy," Victor continued, his voice steady. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Jenna. I know I don't deserve it. I've spent these months reflecting on everything I've done, everything I've hidden from you. I can't change the past, but I can tell you that I'm trying. I'm trying to become the person you thought I was." Jenna sat in silence, letting his words sink in. She felt no anger, no outrage, just an overwhelming sense of sadness. This wasn't the man she had fallen in love with. This wasn't the man she had married. The man she had once believed in was gone, replaced by someone who had spent years lying to her, hiding his true self behind a mask of normalcy. She couldn't deny the fact that his words were sincere, that he was trying to make amends in his own way. But that didn't change the reality of the damage he had caused. "I'm glad you're seeking help, Victor," she said quietly, her voice devoid of the bitterness she had once felt. "But I can't go back. I can't change what happened. And I can't unsee the truth about you." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Victor didn't respond at first, and Jenna felt the weight of his silence pressing down on her. For the first time in their relationship, she was no longer trying to protect him, no longer worried about his feelings. She was no longer afraid to confront the truth. "I understand," Victor finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Jenna, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry, and that I'll always carry the guilt of what I've done." The conversation ended soon after, but Jenna didn't feel the relief she had expected. She hadn't expected to feel anything, really. At least, not in the way she had once thought she would. She had always imagined that one day, she would be able to forgive him, that one day, they would both be free of the chains of the past. But now, she realized that forgiveness wasn't what she needed. What she needed was to accept that some things could never be undone. Some wounds could never be healed, no matter how much time passed. What had happened between them, what Victor had done, could not be erased by apologies or therapy. And Jenna understood, perhaps for the first time, that moving on didn't mean erasing the past. It meant accepting it, learning from it, and allowing herself to find peace in spite of it. The conversation marked the final chapter in their story. Jenna knew, in that moment, that she had given Victor all she could. She had tried, for years, to love him and to believe in the man he had presented to her. But the man he truly was had been too far gone for her to save. She had done everything she could, and now she had to let him go, completely. It was time to fully return to herself, to embrace the woman who had emerged from the wreckage of her marriage. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first married Victor. She had been forged in the fire of betrayal, of heartbreak, and of the crushing weight of truth. And though it had been painful, it had made her stronger. She was no longer afraid of the darkness. She had faced it, and now she could move forward, armed with the wisdom and strength she had gained along the way. Jenna had learned that while the past could never be erased, the future was hers to create. And with that knowledge, she began to build a new life for herself, one that was no longer defined by the lies and the secrets of her marriage, but by the truth she had fought so hard to uncover. And in the end, that was all she needed.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.